Racist cops laugh at the black war hero like he's invisible, until Big Shaq enters the diner. The room falls silent. No shouting, no threats, just truth hanging heavier than uniforms. When Big Shaq steps in, the tables don't just turn, they catch a mirror, and suddenly, America finds itself on trial. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Daylight streamed through the windows of a modest roadside diner, the kind of place where time moved at a human pace. Nostalgic booths, formica tables, the gentle clink of coffee cups. Inside, seated alone at a corner booth, was Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal. He was easily recognizable, towering frame, warm eyes, an aura that turned heads. But in this quiet moment, he felt like any other man, not a celebrity, not a legend, just someone waiting. As he sipped his coffee, he watched the morning ritual unfold. An elderly woman slid in behind him, greeting the waitress by name. A group of teenagers joked over pancakes. The world orbited around him in flashes of normalcy, and yet Shaq felt the weight of something bigger, the burden of fame. Each headline, each spotlight, a reminder that being an icon came with a ledger of expectations, a ledger of hurts. He thought of his daughter, Manara, somewhere miles away by now, chasing her own small dreams. She counted on him, not just as a father, but as a guide in a world that often measured people by assumptions, not souls. He thought of his wife, Shawnee, with her steady strength, the kind that refused to be quiet even when she needed to be. And his mother, Lucille, he remembered her soft lullabies and firm convictions. They taught him that real strength came disguised as humility, that kindness never signaled weakness, that passing on injustice was the same as holding its torch. Another sip of coffee. Bitter. Familiar. He allowed himself the smell of grease, and toast, and early conversations, mundane, yes, but alive. For him, these ordinary moments were anchors, a reminder that beneath the trophies, beneath the contracts, beneath all the bright lights, sat a man who once played barefoot, dreaming of more than fame, dreaming of fairness. In the hush of this morning, a memory surfaced. A simple vow, made years ago at his smallest kitchen table, sworn to Lucille's patient gaze. After a heated argument about a slim paycheck, he'd promised never to walk away, when it mattered, not when people needed him most. That promise echoed now in his chest like a second heartbeat. He set down his cup and folded his hands. He didn't know yet what would happen today. This was before the moment began, before he noticed the war veteran in the booth across the room, before he heard the sharp laughter of cops that didn't belong. But he already felt that weight. He felt the gravity of his own presence, the echo of purpose that had carried him from courts to stardom to right now this diner. He was aware of the paradox. The world saw him as invincible. But he felt fragile, as if a single misstep could shatter the fragile balance he carried. A wrong word, a misread glance, a failure to act, and yet he sensed something shifting in the air, a tension beneath the hum of conversation, a current threatening to pull him into something larger than simple breakfast. He let his thoughts settle into calm observation. Each person in the diner, a piece of a larger mosaic. The waitress wiping a spill. A young man staring at his phone, oblivious to the world. The morning shift of human drama unfolding. Friction and smiles and glances. And somewhere beyond sight but present in his mind, was the echo of injustice. Racial undercurrents that rippled under polite smiles. Under silent tables. Under conversations that never quite touched what lay beneath. Here was the quiet hero nobody saw. The man whose muscles and fame could dominate arenas, yet whose true power was the patience to watch. To wait for a moment that demanded more than noise. To hold himself ready, to prepare to stand. The diner's door chimed. As someone entered, Big Shaq acknowledged the sound, but not the presence yet. His posture remained casual, open. He didn't want suspicion. He wanted clarity. He let his vision scan the booths, the tables, the faces, not to judge, not to challenge, just to see. What he saw was a quiet war zone. A veteran sat alone. He carried himself with dignity that demanded recognition, an unspoken testimony etched into posture and scar. The hush surrounding him spoke volumes. And then came the laughter. A trio of police officers at a table not far away, their voices loud, casual, amused. The laughter that stung, that pricked, that turned undercurrents into veiled bullets. Shaq hesitated. He anchored himself with a breath. Good. Calm. But he felt that old weight rise again, the promise, made years ago, not to walk away. And so he watched. He listened to the laughter, the offhand comments, the casual bigotry disguised as humor. A veteran, an American hero sitting there, invisible, while the ones sworn to protect him thought it funny to mock his face, his service, his history in this country. The room blurred around Shaq. The cafe's sounds dimmed. The laughter became unlikely crescendos. Inside him, something purified. A readiness ignited. Not rage. Exactly. But a firm knowing that this moment mattered. That fairness meant something. That silence meant consent. And he was not consenting. He remembered Lucille's voice. Speak your truth even when your voice shakes. He remembered Mara's questions. Why did they laugh, Daddy? He remembered Shawnee's firm gaze. When she asked what he would do when the world turned again, he remembered a million moments that whispered, "You are bigger than basketball. You are bigger than yourself." The coffee now cold. The promise warmed his chest. He stood quietly. No sudden moves. No noise. Just gravity. Just every ounce of purpose he carried. And in that motion, the diner held its breath. Because the quiet hero had finally decided to be seen. Jericho Brooks sat with the posture of a man who had fought wars both foreign and domestic. The booth in the far back corner of the diner wasn't his first choice. It rarely was for men like him. But it gave him the one thing he needed: visibility without engagement. He sat upright, shoulders stiff under a worn army jacket, adorned with ribbons and patches faded by time. His dark brown skin held the sheen of age, not weakness. His eyes, though dimmed by years, still scanned the room like a soldier watching for landmines that no longer exploded, but wounded all the same. The waitress had passed him twice without stopping, once with a smile for the couple by the window, again with coffee for the trio of off-duty cops across the room. Jericho had only asked for a menu when he entered. Quietly, respectfully, with the kind of practiced humility that came from decades of being taught not to stir the pot, not to raise your voice, not to look too long, not to expect fairness. He knew this game. The Southern diner, draped in American flags and black and white photos of better days, wasn't made for men like him to feel welcome. The walls might have celebrated veterans in uniforms, but not the kind of uniforms worn by men whose names never made it into the plaques. His name was etched instead in history books no one read, and on dog tags that no one asked about. The staff didn't need to tell him they saw him. Their silence was enough. Their neglect spoke louder than slurs ever could. It was a silence practiced through generations, the kind where racism didn't announce itself. It simply hung in the air like the smell of grease, heavy and permanent. Across the diner, the three cops laughed. Not the kind of laughter shared between friends after a long shift, but the kind weaponized by audience. Their voices rose above the clatter of forks and ceramic. They weren't speaking to Jericho, but they might as well have been. One of them glanced over, elbowed the other, said something too low to hear but loud enough to spark a fresh round of cackles. Jericho didn't move, didn't flinch. This wasn't new. He remembered a time, decades ago, when the enemy had a flag and a gun. Now the enemy wore smiles and badges, and they didn't shoot bullets. They fired doubt, invisibility, humiliation. This was their battlefield now. And still, he sat, a warrior's dignity, held together not by pride, but survival. He reached for the glass of water that had been left on his table 40 minutes ago. No refills offered. No apologies. Just condensation running down the sides, like slow sorrow. He sipped and watched. The lead cop, broad-chested, buzz-cut, sunburnt, leaned back in his chair like a man who owned the room. His voice was loud, performative. He made jokes about decorated heroes who forgot how to bathe, and about certain kinds of soldiers who must have served in the kitchen. The other two laughed like they'd heard it all before. They probably had. Jericho's hand tightened around his glass. He had not survived Vietnam, the Gulf, and years of civil backlash to let a few overfed uniforms shame him. But he had also learned that speaking wasn't always survival. Sometimes silence was strategy. His dignity would not become their entertainment. Not today. The laughter crescendoed again. Sharper now. Targeted. The jokes became less coded. More aggressive. A mocking salute. An exaggerated limp. Still, Jericho sat. He didn't need to perform respect. He had already paid its price in full. With years. With friends lost. with medals that didn't protect him from being followed in stores or refused service in diners like this one. He was a man taught to endure, not to explode. But even endurance has its edges. And then, something shifted. Not in the sound, not in the light, but in the atmosphere. A quiet gravity filled the room, the kind that draws attention before the mind even knows why. Heads turned, voices lowered, the laughter lost its rhythm. Jericho noticed it too. Not because he saw him, but because he felt him. The weight of someone rising, slow and deliberate. A towering presence now standing not far from where the cops sat. Shaquille O'Neal. The man with the calm eyes, and an aura carved by both arenas in pain. The moment hung still. Shaq didn't speak, not yet. But Jericho saw the change in the cops' faces. They recognized him instantly, of course. Everyone did. But it wasn't celebrity that silenced them. It was confrontation. The knowledge that someone they couldn't intimidate had stepped into the frame. Jericho watched with cautious intrigue. He'd seen men puff up in defense of others before, only to fade when things got complicated. But something about Shaq was different. There was no anger in his stance, no loud gestures, just resolve, a readiness, and a truth too big to ignore. Shaq glanced toward Jericho, their eyes meeting for the briefest second. No words were needed. Recognition passed between them, not of fame, not of rank, but of struggle, of shared weariness, of mutual understanding born from different paths, walked on the same wounded ground. In that second, Jericho felt something shift inside him, not hope exactly, but maybe validation, that he hadn't imagined it all. That the silence wasn't paranoia, that what was happening was real, and that someone finally was willing to call it by its name. The diner didn't move. No one breathed too loudly. The balance had shifted. The spotlight, unwanted and unspoken, now hovered over the uniformed laughter, daring it to continue. Jericho reached for his cold water again. The condensation no longer looked like sorrow. It looked like something waiting to boil. The laughter in the diner didn't stop. It morphed, from casual to deliberate, from careless to cruel. It now had aim. It had a target. Jericho Brooks. And like gunfire in a ghost town, every chuckle cracked through the quiet tension like a warning shot. The cops, emboldened by the silence of the room, leaned into their performance. One of them, Officer Langley, the youngest of the trio, leaned back with a smug grin and stage whispered, "Bet he got those medals for dodging dish duty, huh?" The others chuckled. A rehearsed sound too quick to be spontaneous. The words weren't just jokes. They were weapons dressed as humor. The people at the nearby tables glanced up, some stifling nervous giggles, others pretending they hadn't heard. That was always the dance, wasn't it? A room full of Americans caught between comfort and conscience, unsure whether to laugh, speak, or simply look away. Most chose the last. The waitress avoided Jericho's booth like it had turned radioactive. A young man with headphones paused his music, not wanting to be involved, but too human to ignore it completely. Shaq had remained seated through it all, but his eyes never left the cops. His silence wasn't approval, it was analysis. He was measuring, gauging, and somewhere beneath his calm surface, a tide had started to rise. Jericho, however, remained stone still. His fingers wrapped around his now lukewarm coffee, his eyes fixed somewhere between memory and detachment. He had heard it all before. At bus stops, in job interviews, behind closed doors. Racism never needed new language. It just recycled old insults in fresher tones. He brought the cup to his lips, not because he wanted to drink, but because it gave him something to do while the performance played out. His silence wasn't surrender. It was endurance. Every breath he took was a refusal to give them what they wanted. His anger, his outrage, his voice cracking under pressure. The oldest officer, Reynolds, had the kind of sun-worn skin that came from years of easy power. He tapped his badge lightly and looked toward Jericho with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You know what they say," he smirked. "Some heroes are made. Others just know how to play the sympathy card." That was the shot that crossed the line. Shaq's napkin was already in his hand, but at those words he placed it down on the table with a precision that felt final. His eyes, which had scanned the room like a lighthouse, narrowed. Not in fury, not in fear. In certainty. The certainty that the moment he'd felt building was finally here. He stood, slowly. Not to make a scene, not to challenge, but to declare something more profound than protest. Shaq's height alone demanded attention. His movement turned heads, but it was the calmness, an eerie grounded stillness that chilled the laughter in the room. The diner wasn't ready, but it had no choice. Langley looked up first, his smile faltering. The smugness washed from his face like chalk under a hose. Reynolds leaned back, crossing his arms, trying to hold on to the false comfort of his badge. The third cop, Donovan, shifted in his seat, eyes narrowing with a kind of defensive curiosity. Shaq didn't speak yet. He didn't have to. His silence now carried weight the laughter could not compete with. He stepped away from his booth, eyes locked not on the cops but on Jericho. Not checking for approval, just letting the veteran know, "You're not alone. Not today." Jericho looked up slowly. The weight of years pressed behind his gaze, but so did a flicker of something unexpected. Relief. Gratitude? No. Respect. Two men. Two generations. One shared understanding of what it meant to live inside skin, that the world judged before knowing. Shaq turned to the room. His expression didn't change. His voice hadn't been used yet, but the diner had already gone still. The clatter of plates stopped. Forks hovered above food. The air felt heavier, like a storm before rain. The cops tried to recover their footing. Reynolds forced a smirk. "Hey, big guy. You lost or just bored?" His voice cracked slightly under the weight of his own nerves. He wasn't used to being confronted, especially not by someone whose presence outclassed his authority. Shaq didn't answer. Not yet. His gaze shifted to the waitress, to the onlookers, to every single person who had allowed the spectacle to unfold unchecked. And in that quiet inventory, he told them everything they needed to hear. This wasn't just about Jericho. It was about every room like this, every morning like this, where racism wore a smile and justice sat alone. Shaq wasn't here to fight. He was here to remind them someone was always watching. And this time that someone had nothing to lose. Reynolds shifted again. The smugness began to fade. He wasn't afraid of Shaq physically. No one needed to be. Shaq wasn't angry in the way they were prepared for. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flailing. He wasn't giving them anything they could mock or label or reduce. He was just present. And for men like Reynolds, presence without fear was the greatest threat. Jericho finally put down his coffee. His eyes followed Shaq's movement with quiet awe, not because he needed saving, but because for the first time in a long time, someone had decided that silence was no longer acceptable currency. The moment didn't end. It hovered, suspended, everyone waiting for the next move. Shaq finally broke the silence, not with words, but with a single deliberate step forward. He wasn't going to the cops. He was going to Jericho, to sit beside him, to show the room what solidarity looked like when it was embodied, not hashtagged. And just like that, the laughter died. Because the joke had ended, and no one was laughing anymore. Big Shaq. O'Neill rose from his booth, with deliberate slowness, as if gravity itself yielded to his weight. His enormous frame filled the aisle instantly, and even before he spoke, the diner responded. Clattering forks paused mid-air. Conversations tapered to whispered silence. No bravado, no swagger, just presence, the kind that both demands attention and carries meaning in its stillness. The three officers froze, mid-laugh or mid-sip. Their amusement evaporated in the face of his calm. Langley looked away first, eyes darting to the exit. He had never been commanded by someone like this. Not with a uniform, not with a weapon, never. Not with a man who carried fame, warmth and quiet authority, all at once. Shaq's voice broke the hush. It was low, measured, sharper than any raised tone. His words were carefully chosen, not to enrage, but to expose. "This room," he began, "has become a showcase, not of bravery or honor, but of something subtler, and far more dangerous." In that moment, the room felt smaller, every inch shrinking under that simple declaration. He didn't address the cops directly. Instead, he gazed around, letting each patron in the diner feel the weight of his presence. "They're laughing at a man who bled for the same country they claim to protect," Shaq said, voice steady. "A man whose medals mean more than the badge pinned on a uniform, especially when that badge is used to mock, to silence, to diminish." In a single phrase, Shaq indicted not just the offenders at that table, but the room, the culture, the quiet complacency that allowed oppression to masquerade as humor. Each syllable landed like a stone, dropped in still water, the ripples unavoidable. His tone held echoes of his childhood. when his mother, Lucille, would guide him through life's cruelties with nothing more than integrity. He remembered nights at home, her voice firm even in exhaustion. Shaq, use your strength as protection for yourself, but also for others. It had been a lesson ingrained, not through force but example. My mom raised me to stand with truth, even when it's the loneliest road. He paused, letting that memory linger. Across the room, Jericho Brooks watched his giant sit down, and in doing so, made the room lean in. Shaq continued, quieter now, but unwavering. My daughter, Memara, she asked me once, Daddy, when do you speak? I told her, when hearts need to listen, when dignity is on trial. There it was, sharp as glass. The notion that silence in the face of injustice is itself a betrayal, that his power wasn't his height or bank account, but his decision to use both in defense of others. No threats, no fists, just the truth, cleaving through layers of denial. You could almost hear the room inhale. Patrons shifted, eyes cast downward, or held on Shaq, waiting. The servers, moving gingerly, betrayed the tension they held in place with every practiced pause. Even the radio's old playlist seemed to fade, as if the diner itself recognized the moment had transcended typical morning routines. The officers' smiles had vanished. Langley's face was pale, his hands clenched under the table. Reynolds glanced at Donovan, lost in a look of confusion that bordered on fear. They were trained to command space, to cast authority, but this wasn't training. This was moral reckoning, and they had forgotten how to respond. Shaq turned his gaze on them, then quiet. Observing, recognizing they were not beneath confrontation, but above it. It was an invitation to choose, to step back from the embarrassment they'd created. The performance of dominance no longer fit this space. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask forgiveness. He simply paused, the calm before any storm of accountability. And for a moment, just a heartbeat, everyone in the diner was there, waiting. Breaking the silence coated the moment with weight. Shaq spoke the words that no one in that moment could ignore. Every day, someone like Jericho walks into places like this, carrying more weight than any trophy or uniform ever offered, and we welcome them with contempt. He paused again, voice softening. That's not patriotism. That's prejudice. No one dared interrupt. A stray clink of a fork felt loud. The diesel rumble of the road outside still hummed, as if suspended, waiting to resume only when the room exhaled. Shaq's presence, the way it shifted the air, made the stakes clear. This wasn't about one set of officers. It was about the unspoken rules that let them laugh, that let them hide behind humor and badge, that normalized racial diminishment. He stepped closer to Jericho's booth. No dramatic gesture, just shared space, two men standing in quiet solidarity, different ages, different battles, but a shared current of dignity. Jericho lifted his chin slightly, eyes holding steady, no need for words. What Shaq had done was enough. The officers were adrift. Without the lull of audience complicity, without the distraction of laughter, their choices were laid bare. Continue the performance? Bow out publicly? The tension in their bodies spoke of sudden realization. They were no longer in charge of the narrative. Shaq was. The hush held, as Shaq looked back around the room, then finally spoke again. This isn't theoretical, it's inherited. My mom taught me this. I'm raising my daughter with the truth. He nodded once, a subtle sign of resolve. It wasn't a challenge. It was a covenant. We can choose something better. Now. Time returned slowly. A spoon hit a saucer. A patron let out a breath. The radio played on. The waitress moved toward the officer's table, gaze fixed in a way it hadn't been before. The cops tried to shift the recounting of their day, glared at the walls or their coffee. The crowd held new tension. Not easy apology, but present awareness. Shaq looked at Jericho, then at the officers. Without raising his voice, he'd shone light on something no one could ignore. Racism disguised as humor, denial dressed in complacency, and chosen silence, once meant as peace, now revealed as complicity. He stepped back, still calm, still imposing. He'd done what he came to do, not with violence, but with undeniable truth. The air reset around him, charged with uneasy possibility, and the diner, once ordinary, once habituated to its rhythms, would never be quite the same again. Officer Trent Huxley sat rigid in his chair, trying to maintain the armor of ease he wore so comfortably just minutes before. The laughter that had once danced out of his throat now lingered at the back of it, stuck, sour. The weight of Shaquille O'Neal's words had landed on him harder than he'd expected. He wasn't the loudest of the three officers. He didn't craft the jokes, but he'd laughed. He'd nodded. He'd let it happen. And now, the silence surrounding him felt like exposure. Shaq had returned to his seat, but the room had not returned to normal. Trent's eyes occasionally lifted to catch the giant's profile, each glance cutting deeper than he'd admit. Shaq didn't even need to look back. He already had Trent locked in a place that went deeper than eye contact. He'd called the room out, but Trent felt something worse. He'd been seen, not just as a cop, as a man, flawed, cracked, fragile. Trent shifted in his seat, arms crossed tighter. It was muscle memory, self-preservation, but the words kept echoing. It's not theoretical, it's inherited. That line lodged itself like a splinter in his chest. Trent had never thought of himself as racist. That word was for extremists, not guys who married blondes and wore Oakleys, and paid their taxes. But that was the problem, wasn't it? It was too easy to hide behind the badge, behind the uniform, behind the right side of the law. His fingers tapped the table in a rhythm that wasn't calming him. Across from him, Officer Reynolds kept his gaze straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge anything. Langley was scrolling through his phone now, pretending indifference. But Trent wasn't pretending. He was unraveling. He could still hear the mocking tone he'd used. The way he'd leaned back after Reynolds made the sympathy card remark, and chuckled, because that's what you did in those circles. You didn't interrupt. You played along. That was the unspoken pact, but it hadn't been harmless. He knew that now. He'd seen Jericho's face, that composed stillness, that quiet dignity that withstood the insult with more strength than Trent could comprehend. Then there was Shaq towering, not just in size but in presence. Trent had grown up watching him, posters on the bedroom wall, late-night highlights. He remembered once wearing a Shaq jersey to a cookout in high school, flexing in front of the mirror, trying to look bigger than his lanky frame. That version of Trent admired Shaq, idolized him. Now, here he was, 38 years old, sitting in a diner while that same man, larger than life, called out every layer of false comfort he'd ever wrapped himself in. And Shaq hadn't done it with rage. He hadn't pointed fingers or raised a fist. He'd spoken like a man who had seen too much to lie anymore. And in that clarity, Trent saw himself not the decorated officer, but the boy beneath the badge, scared of being wrong. The uniform was supposed to mean something. Protect, serve, uphold. But when had it become a shield from reflection? When had it become easier to laugh along than to speak up? Shaq had pierced through every excuse he carried, not for show, not to shame, but because he refused to let a man walk away unchanged. Trent's hands lowered to his lap. His breathing slowed, but not with peace, more like tension yielding to realization. He didn't fear black men. He feared the reckoning inside himself. The part of him that would have to admit that silence was complicity, that knowing better and still saying nothing was its own brand of harm. He looked over at Jericho, still seated, back straight, hands folded calmly in front of him. Jericho hadn't said a word to him, didn't need to. His presence alone was an indictment, a veteran ignored, dismissed, reduced to a target by men who wore flags on their sleeves. Trent felt the sting of shame, not performative guilt, but a deeper raw awareness of his own role in the quiet machinery of oppression. And then Shaq looked at him. Not a glare, not a scowl, just a steady, observant glance that held the weight of generations. Trent met his eyes, reflex tightening his shoulders. But there was no room to hide. Shaq saw him, all of him, not just the badge, the belt, the posture, but the man inside, the scared one, the conflicted one, the one still learning what justice actually required. The diner's air was thick, not with smoke or grease, but with confrontation unspoken. And Shaq, never breaking that gaze, gave him a look that said, "I won't let you look away. Not from him. Not from yourself." Trent swallowed hard. The first thought that came to him was simple and unrefined. I want to be better. Not just for his career, not just to save face, but because for the first time, someone had held up a mirror, and the reflection stared back, undeniable and aching. He thought of his own daughter. She was 10. Bright, curious, with a laugh that made him forget bad days. Would she ask one day who he was in moments like this? What would he tell her? That he laughed, that he looked away, that he wore a badge and stood silent while others were humiliated. Trent clenched his jaw. He didn't know what came next. He wasn't ready for redemption. This wasn't a Hollywood scene. No grand apology would rewrite what had been said. But something had cracked. A shift, small but seismic. The kind that rewrites the quiet parts of a man. The other officers stayed frozen, complicit in their own unraveling. The rest of the diner remained hushed. No one reached for their phones. No one moved. Because they too saw the shift in Trent's expression. The quiet collapse of certainty replaced by the raw beginnings of change. Shaq finally looked away, not dismissively, but with a kind of trust. A passing of responsibility. He had done his part. Not to shame, but to awaken. The rest was up to Trent. The badge on his chest felt heavier now. Not because it meant less, but because it meant more than he'd ever realized. Shaq sat back down, glancing at Jericho with quiet resolve. The silence in the diner had shifted again. Not just uneasy but unusually attentive. Patrons leaned forward as if anticipating conviction. Shaq's voice, when he spoke, held both weight and warmth, an invitation to honesty more than an accusation. He began with the easiest target, the locker room. A place built on camaraderie, trust and competition. But also a place where the casual and unspoken, often betrayed truths. In professional locker rooms, he reflected, I heard laughter at the expense of teammates, not for performance, but for color. Jokes tossed around so cleverly no one noticed their pain. Like grapes in wine. Subtle, sweet, deadly. A hush followed his words. The waitress paused at the next table, pulled back as though listening to a storyteller. Even the cops looked toward him, though uneasily. He spoke of boardrooms next. The polished tables where business deals happened. Meals served on crisp linen, and words floated like silk. Of course, they'd say, he's a great representative, but only until someone said he's intimidating. Then that polish cracked, a reminder that success for a man like me could always be reduced to threat. A murmured silence floated through the room like smoke. Every coffee cup was held a second longer. Every set of eyes fixed on Shaq as though the diner's walls were slipping, revealing a sharper, harsher world beyond. And breakfast counters. Shaq continued. These ordinary places just like this one where you pay attention in daylight, but the undercurrents run dark. A server compliments you with forced sincerity. A driver waits an inch too close. A door held just a moment too long. You smile, you thank them. But inside you tally each slight. You learn how to survive. He paused, letting the tension land. Then he leaned forward, voice quieter, more introspective. I remember the first time I heard ape, behind my back. A teammate slipped away from the conversation, then laughed, knowing I couldn't hear. It was meant not to hurt me, but to remind me, you're always watched, always judged. Heads dipped, the reality of that moment weaving into the diner's fabric. Some faces registered empathy, some guilt, some recognition of a truth they'd never named. Shaq shifted positions. He'd turned the booth and the officer's table into a courtroom, but with himself as the prosecutor, not as judge. It was a trial of the culture, the room, the American dreams, unspoken caveats. We protect the veneer of kindness, he said softly, but allow the poison underneath. We smile while distancing, offer compensation and call it healing. He met the eyes of the waitress at the counter when he said it. She quivered, not from shame, but from the ache of knowing it was true. He met the young couple at the center table, their brunch forgotten, their attention complete. He paused again, and then spoke of the fans, the ones who'd cheer his dunks, wear his jersey, but whisper judgments the moment the lights dimmed. They'd stand in line for a Shaq autograph, he said, but talk behind their friend's back. He's great on the court, but off it. That ellipsis, it never ended. They swallowed their words in public and spat them in private. And I understood it wasn't just me. It was the way we allowed ourselves to speak American truths silently. The room felt colder now, but vibrant. Shaq had dismantled the illusions layer by layer. Not with anger, but with precision. He stood, leaning over Jericho's booth, with a gentleness that felt reconciliatory. This isn't accusation, he said. It's acknowledgement that these things, words, glances, jokes, are small tests of humanity, and we've failed too often. The youngest officer, Langley, looked away. Reynolds swallowed hard. Trent shifted in his seat, hands now open and exposed on the table. He'd said nothing, yet he'd heard it all. Shaq's courtroom felt weighted, not with judgment, but with truth. He continued, softer still. If we only acted when someone screamed at us, we'd be fools. But when they snicker beneath their breath, when they drop a compliment that's loaded, when they hold the door just long enough, you learn not just what hate sounds like, but what it hides behind. Shaq's gaze swept over the room, not in accusation, but in challenge. What happens now isn't on me, he said. It's on everyone. The people feeding off laughter at another's expense. The bystanders holding their breath. The systems that let jokes slip and then shrug. Each of us carries shapes we dare not speak. Jericho shifted, lifting his head slowly. There was an energy in his look, not anger, nor relief, but recognition. A silent handshake between two men who'd walked different paths, but landed on the same truth. Denial is the hardest thing to break. Shaq finally settled back in his booth, the edge of his words still sharp in the air. The waitress returned with coffee for both him and Jericho, placing the cups carefully. No awkwardness, no apologies, just a return to service, now infused with awareness. He looked down at his cup and said, almost to himself, "Today daylight spoke, and it spoke through all of us." He glanced at the cops then. Now the question is, what do we do with it? The diner didn't answer. Silence had weight. The room felt smaller now, an unspoken acknowledgement that daylight revealed truths they couldn't unsee. The light that once offered comfort now illuminated responsibility. The radio clicked on softly. A classic soul song began in the background. It felt fitting, not a soundtrack of triumph, but of reckoning. Shaq lifted his cup toward Jericho. Jericho met it with a nod. They drank, and the diner exhaled. Not with relief, but with the recognition that what was unsaid in daylight had finally been heard. Jericho Brooks remained still, a moment longer, after Shaq's toast. The muted soul track lingered between sips of coffee, its notes stretching over the tables like a confession. He said nothing. His face was open, lined with years of battles outside this diner, and inside his own mind. The others watched him, unsure. The silence had weight. Then, almost too quietly to hear, Jericho began. "My tour began in '68, he said, voice even but low. "Vietnam." The words emerged like stones revealed from deep water. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. Some patrons leaned forward. The officers straightened, chairs grinding. The waitress paused midway to the counter, listening. "You'd see things," Jericho continued. "You'd carry them with you, even when you got home. The war never ended. It just moved inside you." His eyes flicked across the diner, landing on faces that struggled to stay composed. "I fought for this country. I believed in it. But when I came home to doors closed tight, to stares that said I didn't belong." He paused. The faint hum of the heater signaled a paused world. He lifted his hand, as if feeling for the metals hidden beneath his jacket. "These," he said, voice catching, "weren't shields. They didn't stop the venom of slurs, threats, job refusal. They didn't stop a man in uniform from laughing." His gaze settled on the cops. He held their attention, not accusing, but laying bare the context of his journey. A waitress dabbed at a drip on a saucer. A teenager tapped his foot. Silent. All eyes were now on Jericho. Shaq's presence had opened the room. Jericho's words widened the door. "I'm not looking for pity," he said. "I survived. Every day you feel it. The flashbacks, the loneliness, the shame of walking into the same towns you saved when you believed no one would see you." His voice trembled only once before settling back into steady resolve. "I came home believing the medals meant something. That hope came back with me. But reality spat on it." The youngest cop swallowed. Langley's fingers curled around his glass. Reynolds stared straight ahead, hands clenched. Trent looked at his badge, then away. Their laughter felt small now, inadequate. The echo of Jericho's hurt outmatched his policies, not by volume, but by gravity. Jericho lowered his gaze, as if offering peace. "I stayed silent for years, because silence felt safer than confrontation. But silence taught no one, not my family, not the world." He rubbed his thumb against his wedding ring. "My children grew up believing their father was a hero, but they never understood how hard it was just to be human in the same country he fought for." He breathed. The room exhaled with him. A hush so complete, it seemed new. The morning noise plates, coffee pours, had retreated. Jericho's quiet honesty paused time. He looked at Shaq. The veteran and the icon met eyes in understanding. Two men stitched into America's complicated fabric, both demanding remembrance. Then Jericho turned back to the officers. "You wore a uniform too, once," he said. "Soldiers of a different badge. Same name. Honor is more than dress. It's what you do when no one's applauding." Reynolds glanced at his partners. Langley shook his head, shaking off dizziness. Trent's throat moved. He blinked hard. Jericho watched them, steady, not expecting absolution, just acknowledgement. "My silence taught me nothing," Jericho said, voice growing stronger. "But it taught others how to stay silent too." He nodded slowly. "I want tomorrow to be different." The strength in his posture belied the inside tremor of his truth. No bravado, no aggression, just raw clarity. Shaq raised his cup again. The others followed, shaken. Jericho drank. The toast was unspoken, but the unity there felt. The officers didn't speak. They couldn't. They no longer belonged to the same room. Their power had shifted, tangled by a story too deep to displace. A waitress refilled Jericho's coffee without being asked. The small act spoke louder than commands. She recognized him now, as a man, not a figure. The cafe had shifted. The war veteran was more than alone. And as Jericho's voice settled into quiet peace, an unspoken verdict hovered. Acknowledgement. Not retribution. Not celebration. A promise. Silence was no longer the barrier. Words had found their weight, and carried them forward. This was the moment when silence broke. Not with shouting, but with truth. Soft and irrevocable. The diner became a hall of reflections, each face catching a part of the unfolding truth. Not just Shaq's confrontation or Jericho's confession, but an honest mirror held to every person present. Through their eyes and reactions, America's fractured identity came into focus. The waitress, Marge, hovered behind the counter. She'd grown up on stories colored by fear and ignorance, never noticing the biases steeped in her upbringing. She smiled at black customers. But she observed them too closely. Her mind filled in stories before she really saw them. Today she felt her internal world tilt. She witnessed Shaq speak not to shame, but to educate. She watched Jericho speak not to punish, but to share pain. She felt guilt for every glance she'd offered that said, "I'm wary." Her hands, still warm from wiping tables, shook slightly. She realized that her childhood lessons weren't just innocent traditions. They were lenses that distorted lives. And now she wanted to take them off. In the middle booth, a young white couple, Claire and Mark, sat frozen. They came for French toast and mimosas, expecting small talk and easy Sunday humor. Not this reckoning. Claire turned to Mark, whispering a question without turning her head. "Do you hear him?" Mark swallowed hard, nodding. They didn't know Jericho, or Shaq beyond a name and a highlight reel, but they felt the depth of what was happening. As Shaq spoke of locker room jokes and boardroom glances, the couple realized they'd laughed at jokes they later realized were hollow. They felt the sting of empathy and shame entwined, a messy mix that stayed with them. Today's brunch became a lesson. Their smiles when they returned carried weight. They weren't empty anymore. At the end of the counter, the busboy, Dylan, angled his phone surreptitiously, capturing Shaq's words. He felt the tremor in the air. He wanted evidence, not for gossip or gain, but to share exactly what these men, heroes both, were doing. In his daily scroll, he saw thousands of noise ads, memes, nonsense. But this was meaning. He tapped record, and he waited, knowing that the ripples from this moment might reach beyond the diner's vinyl seats and grease-spotted tables. The cooks, heads down at the grill, paused too, not to catch flaming skillets, but to listen. They felt the weight of their workspace change, turning from background to witness. They'd seen countless customers. None had made them wonder what justice really meant. Now each fry and sizzle underscored a complexity they hadn't had to face, and that unsettled them in a good way. Shaq didn't lash out. He deconstructed power gracefully, through story, through presence, through subtle authority. He wasn't about fist-twisting. He was about mind-widening. He showed power could be patient and still transform, that it could shine without blinding. That true authority didn't need a spotlight. It created one. As the waitress cleared a table near the cops, Marge realized she could no longer see Jericho as a shadow. He was flesh, bone, silence amassing into speech. The young couple splayed in the center booth, acknowledged their complicity in systems they barely understood. The busboy held the phone steady, capturing the turning point of everyday courage. Each person's eye reflected a different shade of understanding. But all were seeing the same picture unfold. Justice doesn't demand spectacle. It needs recognition. Even the officers, stiff at first, began to register their roles in this mirror. Between their breaths, they too saw the layers, lifetimes of hidden bias, accidental dismissals, small cruelties that felt inconsequential until they weren't. They looked at each other in uncertainty, each question unspoken. What did we do today? Shaq leaned back, finishing his coffee, as though the day had not held gravity. But he felt it shift, and so did the room. He closed his eyes briefly, and the room exhaled. This exhalation wasn't relief. It was reorientation. Something had changed in how power looked, how power sounded. Power didn't roar. Sometimes it spoke, softly, so everyone could lean in and listen. The diner's radio ticked to life again, picking up the rhythm of normalcy. But the notes today carried a different tune. Patrons returned to scrambled eggs and blueberry pancakes. But beneath the comfort of food, they carried weight. Marge cleaned a spilled milkshake slowly, thinking of her next customers as people to be truly seen. Claire and Mark held hands over their table, not for romance, but for unity. Dylan turned off his recording with a purpose. He knew he'd share it, not for applause but for awareness. Every small choice they made after this moment held the shape of what they'd seen. Shaq stood and walked to the door without fanfare. Jericho followed, his steps steady, unsure of applause but certain of presence. The cops remained seated, unsettled but changed. The power dynamic had shifted. No fists thrown, no arrests made, but power redistributed through awareness and responsibility. The busboy lowered his phone. The waitress picked up a few dishes. The cooks returned to their grills. And the diner began breathing, quieter now, not because the storm was over, but because clarity had settled in its place. Outside, daylight still streamed through the windows. But it illuminated more than just a coming day. It revealed reflections people couldn't unsee. And inside, America, as represented in that humble diner, stood facing itself, batch by batch, plate by plate, word by word. Officer Trent Huxley sat with his badge burning against his chest, as if the weight of it had changed in the last hour. The echoes of Jericho's words and Shaq's truth still hung in the air, staining the silence like smoke after a fire. He had no answers for the questions buzzing in his head. He only knew that the badge no longer felt like protection. It felt like a mask he couldn't wear anymore. He glanced at his two partners. Langley sat stiff, eyes glazed, locked in denial or confusion, or both. Reynolds, still defiant in posture, was looking at Shaq with something close to hatred. But beneath that, maybe fear. Trent didn't hate. He wasn't confused. He was ashamed. The shame wasn't theatrical. It wasn't the kind of guilt that came with public accusations or social media fallout. It was deeper, personal. It was about the man he thought he was versus the one he saw in that diner mirror. He hadn't yelled slurs. He hadn't made the jokes. But he'd been there. He'd smirked. He'd said nothing. Shaq's eyes had moved past him now. They weren't locked in a stare down. There was no need. The confrontation had already happened, and Trent had already lost. Not to Shaq but to the truth. He looked down slowly. Then, with a breath deeper than he'd taken in hours, he unclipped the badge from his uniform. The metal caught the light, polished, official, proud. For a moment he stared at it, like one might look at an old photograph of a person they no longer recognized. Then, without a word, Trent set the badge on the table. No one moved. No chairs creaked. No gasps. Just silence. But the silence now carried weight. Dense. Unflinching. Shaq saw it. Jericho did too. Even the busboy paused his sweeping motion to look up, sensing the gravity of the gesture. Trent stood. His knees trembled slightly, but he didn't hesitate. He didn't look to his partners. He didn't explain. He just walked. Slowly. Past the tables. Past the booths. Past the counter where the waitress froze mid-refill. His uniform brushed against the door as it opened, and then he was gone. No one followed. Outside, the morning sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the diner windows. Inside, those who remained stared not at the door, but at the empty space Trent had left behind. Even Reynolds didn't speak. Langley sank into his seat like a man watching the roof collapse. Shaq didn't smile. He didn't nod. There was no triumph in his expression, just stillness. As if a chapter had closed, not with applause but with clarity. Jericho moved next. Slowly, with purpose. He rose from his seat, stiff at the knees, shoulders set. The room shifted around him. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Chairs scraped, bodies leaned aside. Not from obligation, not from fear, from something else. Something rarer. Respect. For the first time in decades, Jericho Brooks stood in a room where people made way. He didn't demand it, he didn't ask for it. But the dignity in his silence, the strength in his truth, it had redrawn the lines, and people stepped back, not because of who he was once, but because of who he had become right in front of them. The waitress nodded at him, quietly, hand hovering over a clean cup. The young couple watched him as if they were seeing history walk. The busboy stopped recording and simply watched, his eyes wide with reverence. The cops didn't speak. They could. Something irreversible had happened, and no training manual prepared them for this. Shaq stood too, side by side with Jericho. Two men, one a legend, the other a forgotten hero, now unified in quiet defiance. The kind that doesn't demand retribution, only recognition. They walked together toward the exit. No dramatic swell of music. No clapping. Just footsteps on linoleum, echoing like a drumbeat of a different kind of justice. As they passed, faces turned. Some held back tears. Some held themselves accountable in silence. In that shared quiet, the diner had transformed. Not into a battlefield, not a courthouse, but a place where truth had finally interrupted routine. The door swung open once more, and light poured in. Shaq held it for Jericho, who nodded once, not as thanks but as understanding. And then they were gone. Inside, the badge still lay on the table. It gleamed under the fluorescent lights, cold and still, a relic. A statement. A silent apology from a man who could no longer carry it the same way. And in the stillness that followed, no one dared to look away. Outside, the day unfolded in full light. No clouds to hide under, no shadows to dilute what had just taken place inside the diner. The sun cast long reflections on the pavement, and Shaq and Jericho walked side by side, their strides slow, deliberate. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was earned. The road stretched quiet in both directions, framed by picket fences and weathered storefronts. The town had seen decades of days like this. But this day would settle differently in its history. Not because of noise, because of Shaq walked with his hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed, mind awake. He glanced sideways at Jericho, whose face held the kind of calm that came not from relief, but release. And in that stillness, Shaq spoke, not with the gravity he carried inside the diner, but with the softness of a father explaining the world to someone who needed it to make sense. "My daughter," he said, "Miara. She's 16. Big heart. Bigger questions." He smiled slightly, eyes narrowing against the sun. "She asked me once if being quiet when something wrong happens makes you guilty too. I told her, it's not just guilt, it's betrayal." Jericho looked over, intrigued. Shaq continued. "See, she hears things. At school. In the media. The way kids talk. Even when they don't know what they're saying. And she looks to me like I've got it figured out. But some days," he exhaled, "some days I don't. I just know what I can't ignore." They crossed a side street. A man sweeping his porch paused to watch them pass, lowering his broom, sensing something unspoken in their movement. Shaq's voice lowered. "I told her that kindness isn't weakness. That strength isn't about size or noise. It's about standing up when it's easier to sit down. And today she'll ask what I did." Jericho's hands were in his jacket pockets, and his eyes remained ahead. But he nodded, slowly, the corners of his mouth tight with restrained emotion. Shaq continued. "I'll tell her about you. About how you sat there, held your ground, while the world around you acted like you didn't matter. And how that silence was the loudest thing I'd heard in a long time." They walked past a bus stop. A boy sitting on the bench stared at them, slack-jawed. He recognized Shaq but didn't call out. He just watched, as if the moment didn't need a name. "I told Miara that people will try to turn her kindness into something naive, that they'll call her soft when she refuses to laugh at cruelty. But I'll remind her she's not alone. That there are men who came before, like you, who knew that the hardest thing to carry isn't a weapon, it's restraint." Jericho glanced at Shaq, his eyes briefly wet. "You teach her well," he said, voice thick, his first words since stepping outside. Shaq nodded, his expression gentle. I try. But this world teaches faster than I can. That's why days like this matter. They paused at the corner, waiting for a truck to pass. Shaq looked back toward the diner, then at the sky, then at the man beside him. Today, he said, I saw that cycle. The one where a man gives everything to a country and gets spat on in return. That ends now. At least for the ones watching. For the ones who heard you. Jericho exhaled through his nose. I almost gave up believing that would ever happen. Shaq's tone didn't shift, but the depth returned. I think we've all been close, but I made a promise, not just to Miera, to my mother, to myself, that I won't walk past injustice, not even if it's quiet. Especially when it's quiet. Jericho stopped walking. He looked Shaq in the eye. You made them listen, Shaquille. That's not small. Shaq shrugged, almost self-conscious. You made them feel. That's bigger. They stood for a moment. 2 generations of strength measured not in force but in presence. A silence followed. Not empty, but sacred. I'll tell Miara you're the kind of man history forgets. Shaq said, but I won't let her forget. Jericho smiled at that. A real tired, grateful smile. You tell her, I saw the world get better for a second today. And maybe that's enough. They turned and continued walking. The world carried on around them. Birds calling, cars passing, kids laughing blocks away. But between them, a promise hung in the air, as tangible as the sun's warmth on their backs. A promise that truth would not always be drowned out. That dignity would not always be silenced. And that when the moment called for it, giants would rise, not with fists, but with voices. Inside the diner, the hum of morning had returned, but it was different now. The plates clinked softer, the conversations held a quieter pitch, and everyone moved as if echoing through a room where something sacred had just occurred. Behind the counter, Dylan, the young busboy, stared at the video on his phone. His hands trembled, not from fear but from the weight of what he'd just captured. It wasn't the resolution that struck him. It was the rawness. The truth. The kind that couldn't be staged. Shaquille O'Neal standing tall, not for applause but for a man the world tried to overlook. A war veteran shamed into silence. A room transformed not by force but by the quiet unraveling of conscience. With one breath, Dylan uploaded the video. It wasn't done for likes or shares. It was instinct. A reflex born from the knowing that this was bigger than the room. It had to be seen, not polished, not filtered, just witnessed. The upload bar crawled across his screen, and as it completed, the ripple began. Within the hour, the footage found its way to every corner of the digital world. Social feeds flooded. Headlines screamed. Twitter hashtags multiplied. Shaq stands. Jericho deserves more. Diner justice. The video was shared by celebrities, activists, athletes, talk show hosts quoted it. Pundits dissected it. And yet, despite all the attention, the heart of the moment stayed where it started, in a small southern diner, on a quiet day that turned into something unforgettable. News anchors narrated the story with urgency. Basketball legend Shaquille O'Neal intervenes in public racism incident, they began. Clips played on loops. Shaq rising. Jericho sitting calm. The badge placed on the table. Headlines called it courage. Others spun it into debate. One conservative outlet dubbed it a media setup. Another questioned whether the officers were victims of cancel culture. But the video didn't care for interpretation. It spoke for itself. Viewers watched, not just the confrontation, but the stillness after. They saw the way the laughter died. The way a room full of people realized complicity wasn't passive. That silence spoke just as loud as cruelty. They saw the officer break down quietly, saw a nation's sickness laid bare in the subtlest of gauges. A badge surrendered, a veteran rising, a man sitting beside another to say, I see you. At home, Miara watched the video on her phone. Her eyes didn't blink, as her father's figure filled the frame. She didn't need to ask what it meant. She already knew. It wasn't about being famous. It was about using whatever platform you had to do what was right, even when no one asked you to, especially then. For those who weren't there, the moment became content. A statement. A cultural marker. But for those inside that diner, it was something else entirely. Marge, the waitress, sat in her kitchen that night. The video playing on a loop. She saw her face in the background. The hesitation. The disbelief. The turning point. She wiped her hands on a towel and whispered to herself. That's when I knew she hadn't been proud of who she'd been. But now she had a point from which to grow. She'd been shown a mirror. It wasn't flattering, but it was true. The young couple, Claire and Mark, replayed the video too. Not for vanity, for remembrance. They talked long into the night about what they'd witnessed. It had made them question the world they took for granted. They promised each other, next time they saw wrong, they wouldn't just sit, they'd speak, they'd stand. The officers remained silent, even as the world scrutinized their every move. Langley deleted his social media. Reynolds issued no statement. Trent Huxley, the one who walked out, didn't speak to reporters. He didn't need to. The image of his badge on the table said more than any interview could. Shaq didn't offer interviews either. He declined talk shows, released no tweets. When reporters caught up with him days later, he said only, "I did what I'd want someone to do for my daughter. That's it." But those who had been inside knew better. They knew this wasn't a redemption arc. It was a reckoning. A confrontation not with villains, but with the casual systems that allowed injustice to feel ordinary. Shaq didn't play a hero. Jericho didn't seek a stage. And yet, in that small moment, they held up a lens to the country, one that couldn't be easily turned away. The video would trend for days, then be replaced by the next outrage, the next meme, the next scandal, but its echo would remain in classrooms, in boardrooms, in locker rooms, in those quiet places where someone might hesitate before telling a joke, before brushing off a story, before staying silent when it mattered. The camera rolled back, yes. But what it captured wasn't just a man stepping in. It was a nation being asked a question it had long avoided. What do you do when truth stands in the middle of your meal? And for once it waited for an answer. Big Shaq O'Neal, sat behind the wheel of his black SUV, idling on a quiet suburban street. The engine's hum was low, rhythmic, almost meditative. His massive hands rested on the steering wheel, fingers interlaced, knuckles faintly white. The late afternoon sun filtered through the windshield, casting long shadows that danced across his face, light and darkness, side by side, much like the world he'd just left behind. This was the first moment of solitude he'd claimed since entering that diner earlier that morning. All voices, all eyes, all the weight of expectation and judgment. They'd stayed inside. Here, now, the world felt still. And yet inside his mind buzzed like a crowded courtroom, replaying every moment, every glance, every chest-tightening second. Not because he needed validation, because he needed clarity. He thought of the officers, their faces shifting when the moment came. Not monsters, just men, human, capable of error and reflection. He thought of Officer Trent Huxley, who'd laid down his badge before anyone could demand it. A forceful admission of change. That quiet surrender echoed louder than any protest. That's what real courage looked like, stepping away, not standing on authority. Shaq exhaled, slow and steady. He thought of Jericho Brooks, the silent warrior whose words had finally broken their decades-long hold, fighting a war only to return to a country blind to his sacrifices, that made the silence deeper, more cutting. Yet his dignity had endured. His truth had spoken louder than any metal glint. He shifted in his seat. The light in the rearview mirror caught his eyes, reflective, resolute. He didn't need accolades. He didn't crave headlines. He only carried a promise rooted in childhood, rooted in his mother's voice, rooted in Mara's unwavering gaze. He remembered Lucille's words, "Speak when it matters, even if your voice shakes." That phrase had carved itself into him, a permanent waypoint. He remembered holding Mara's small hand, looking into those curious eyes, and telling her that one day she'd ask him what he did when the room grew heavy with silence. And he needed to answer truthfully, so he did. Justice wasn't a courtroom. It wasn't a verdict or a sentence. It was a shift in how people saw each other, one human to another. It happened in diners and doorways, at office water coolers, and in living rooms across the country. And every time someone stood when silence felt safer, it pushed the world forward, imperceptible, yet profound. He thought of the video, how a teenage busboy captured a moment that would ripple beyond that diner's walls. It wasn't staged. It wasn't crafted for attention. It was life unfiltered. Shaq didn't seek virality. He only wanted truth. And if truth found a platform, that was enough. Figuring out next steps wasn't necessary. This wasn't a performance. His promise didn't come with a plan. It wasn't policy or platform. It was an ethos, a living standard. That meant standing up again tomorrow. standing up the day after. No matter how small the injustice, no matter who was watching. He sank deeper into the seat. The streetlights flickered on as dusk settled. A car passed by lazily. A dog barked somewhere. The world was moving forward, indifferent yet beautifully persistent. Shaq thought of Mura again. She'd seen him leave that morning, with concern behind her brave smile. She'd texted him multiple times, asking how he felt, if he was okay. She trusted him, and he trusted himself to live up to her trust. He started the car and pulled forward. The tires met the pavement with soft authority. He drove through neighborhoods familiar and anonymous. The diner was far behind now, but its weight remained. It followed him, softened him, grounded him. He thought of the waitress, of Claire and Mark, of Dylan with his phone recording every word. These faces might never meet Shaq again, but their lives had changed, because someone decided to stand. He thought of Officer Reynolds and Langley men, who'd laughed without malice, without awareness. He hoped they would learn. He hoped they would feel the shift in their bones, enough to carry it forward. He thought of Jericho, walking beside him, tall and firm, no longer invisible. He thought of the future Jericho's children would have, a rare inheritance of recognition, not from awards, but from everyday acknowledgement. Every time someone said thank you, veteran, or simply nodded, every time they learned. The road stretched. He turned on the radio, tuning into jazz. No lyrics, no narrative, just sound weaving in and out. The kind of music that cradles complexity. He tapped a finger on the steering wheel. Light. His breathing matched the beat. Shaq didn't need to win hearts or minds. He only needed to let them meet the truth unfiltered. That was it. He pulled into his garage. The overhead door glided shut, sealing him in familiar silence. He stood, quiet in his home's living space. Family photos lined the walls. Lucille with a baby Shaq in her arms. Mira at her first recital, Shawnee smiling beside him during a family dinner. These were his pillars. This was his grounding circle. He opened the fridge, poured water into a glass, and drank. The cold liquid soothed the weariness in his bones. He set the glass down and looked at his reflection in the hallway mirror. He didn't need applause. His own eyes bore witness. He walked into his study. On the desk he scribbled a line in a notebook. Justice is a daily choice. He pressed down on the pen. The words felt truth beneath his skin. As he closed the notebook, he looked toward the window at twilight's glow. He whispered to himself, "When Mamara asks," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She'd already know. One day she will ask. And when she does, he'll hold her close and say, "I stood when the voices fell silent." Because some things aren't about being loud. They're about being present. They're about being honest. They're about lifting others when no one else will. And I promise, that's the kind of man I'll always be. He turned out the light. The room darkened. Outside, a calm night stretched across the sky. He didn't hear applause, but he felt the weight of something greater than recognition. He felt purpose, and that was more than enough. If this story made you pause, don't let the moment end here. Carry it to your dinner table, your workplace, your next hard conversation. Let courage be the new tradition, and awareness the loudest voice in the room. The next time silence feels safer, remember this moment.